Alright, so we've already established that the Radeon X800 XT Platinum Edition was the fastest card in its day, beating the GeForce 1600 Ultra in nearly every test. But we've also established that the 1600 Ultra was the winner in overall features, and was touted as the more feature-proof card thanks to its support of Shader Model 3.0. But how did that really pan out? Was it the truly killer feature that made it stand the test of time? Well, let's put that to the test. This is Pixel Pipes. Just as a quick recap, the 1600 Ultra, due to its lower core clock and sometimes handicapped shader pipes, just couldn't compete against ATI in terms of raw speed. This was true versus the regular X800 XT, the Platinum Edition, and was made worse with the debut of the X850 XT Platinum Edition a little later on. However, if we assert that the 1600 Ultra provided good enough performance at the time, and the fact that you could simply buy a 1600 GT for $100 cheaper and generally be able to overclock it to essentially the same speed, then you might say that the added feature of SM3 actually made it the better buy in the end, right? At the start of Shader Model 3.0 support, this was true to a limited extent. Far Cry and Painkiller, for example, are two excellent 2004 games that received patches later on to support SM3 features. The most prominent change in both cases is lighting. With patch 1.3, Far Cry received true 16-bit per channel floating point high dynamic range lighting, activated by a console command which gives the game a realistically simulated over-brightening effect to mimic the way the human eye reacts to changing lighting conditions. To be clear, this isn't inherently an SM3 feature, but a feature that happens to only be supported by Shader Model 3.0 hardware and newer. The performance drops nearly in half with HDR on, more than enabling anti-aliasing, which will not work alongside this feature on a 6800 Ultra. The use of twice as many bits per channel leads to a massive amount of memory bandwidth use, in addition to the load on the ROPs. It's just on the cusp of being playable at 1280 by 1024 max settings, but it's debatable if this is worth it over having anti-aliasing and a much higher frame rate. As a quick tip, I found you sometimes have to reload the level after enabling HDR to get full performance. Painkiller's enhancements were a little more broad. With patch 1.6.1 applied, you could select Ultra under the dynamic light setting, switching on SM3 features. This gave you greater use of specular highlights on many environmental and character surfaces, as well as a bloom effect for bright lights and reflections. This was only in effect for a select number of levels in the original game, whereas the Battle Out of Hell expansion made more consistent use of them. As you can see, the difference could be quite dramatic, and in my experience, the performance impact was modest. But this was only the beginning. In 2005, we see the introduction of one of the first games to be built from the ground up to use Shader Model 3.0 as part of its graphics engine, and the result was one of the biggest PC gaming controversies of the time. I'm talking about Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. With Shader Model 3.0 enabled, you could make use of higher quality shadows, tone mapping, and parallax bump mapping, offering a cutting-edge visual experience. With anything older, you had to drop all the way down to Shader Model 1.1. Yeah, that's right, DirectX 8.0. This is a peculiar decision considering the vast majority of PC gamers were most likely using Shader Model 2.0 hardware from the past few years, but it makes sense when you realize that this was a console-first game, and a cross-generational one at that. They included the shader pass for the original Xbox and the Xbox 360, and that's it. Tailoring it for the PC just wasn't a major priority. This was fine if you own the latest Radeon X1000 series card, but only a small niche of the market buys the latest and greatest. Needless to say, there was some backlash. For 6800 Ultra owners, it's business as usual, as the game runs just on the edge of playable with all the settings turned up. Granted, I didn't play very far into the game for this video. Then we enter 2006, and the new console generation is in full swing. This means more prevalent use of SM3 and more of yesteryear's graphics cards becoming obsolete. One of the biggest games of the year was The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. The game made heavy use of this shader standard and put HDR lighting at the forefront of its graphical features. In fact, playing the game without HDR just feels off somehow. Everything looks excessively flat, and it becomes quite apparent that the overall look and art style was created with HDR lighting in mind. Cutting edge as it was for 2006, surely this game is too much to handle for 6800 Ultra, right? Well, with middle-ish settings and HDR on, it can actually be playable. You can lower the resolution from 1280 by 1024 to 1024 by 768 if you want a smoother, more consistent frame rate. In fact, my main experience with the game back in the day was on a highly modified and overclocked 6800 GS, which performed around that of a stock 6800 Ultra, and I preferred to leave HDR on then too. Unlike with Far Cry, the feature only takes around a 10% performance hit in general. Past this point, and you're really starting to push it. 2007 is when the next generation of games really started to take shape, and leading the charge was Epic's Unreal Engine 3.0, which was built with the 7th console generation in mind, and required Shader Model 3.0 to even run. One of the earliest examples of a big-budget game using this engine was EA's Medal of Honor Airborne, and unfortunately for the 6800 Ultra, this is really where it stops making sense to try to use this card. At 1024 by 768, the game is unplayable at any settings. You have to bring the settings to the lowest and run at an even lower resolution for the game to be semi-playable. While this would have been an ideal situation for the 6800 Ultra to flex its forward-looking muscle, in the end the performance just isn't there. Yet there's another game from 2007 which also requires Shader Model 3.0, and yet does not use Unreal Engine 3, and that is BioShock. Using a modified Unreal Engine 2.5, this iconic title will not run on an X800 series card. However, at 1024 by 768, virtually all major effects such as post-processing, advanced pixel shaders, and real-time reflections have to be disabled for a truly playable frame rate, leaving the game looking flat and rudimentary. This is such a major compromise in visuals that it isn't really worth it, but if you can stomach dropping all the way down to 800 by 600, yeah, I know, but it actually allows you to turn on both pixel shading and water reflections, the latter of which being rather critical to the overall look of a game with such an inundated environment. And aside from the massive pixels, the game still looks very good at these settings and runs quite comfortably. This represents what is possibly the best case scenario for why the 6800 Ultra, or especially the cheaper 6800 GT, having Shader Model 3.0 support was a killer feature. This was a must-play of its time, and many X800 series owners were up in arms that they didn't get to experience it. I'm sure NVIDIA would have loved for a game like this to arrive even sooner when it was more relevant, as by 2007 it was largely a moot point, with crazy price versus performance deals like the 8800 GT being available. But for GeForce owners that didn't have the means to upgrade, it was vindication that they had made the right choice 3 years earlier. The 6800 series is leveraging a feature that many thought it couldn't use in real-world scenarios, and quite extensively at that. This was a frustrating time for ATI supporters. If you're used to hanging onto your graphics card for 2 years or more, then Shader Model 3.0 was an issue that could have forced an early retirement for your otherwise top-performing hardware purchase from 2004. The thing is, the games shown in this video are only examples that do show a difference with the features supported. The majority of games throughout 2004 and 2005 largely didn't use it or didn't benefit much from it at all. It wasn't until 2007 that we actually saw games that required SM3. And those were built with much newer hardware in mind, so you'd likely need an upgrade regardless. Still, this exploration does show that there were situations where the much-touted Shader Model 3 feature actually did serve an advantage for the NVIDIA camp. And it's an unfortunate decision on ATI's part to not push their features just a little further to meet the hardware requirements needed for SM3, as close as the X800 series already was to reaching that point. It was a blight on an otherwise stellar and incredibly impressive lineup of flagship cards, and if not for that, ATI would be the undisputed king of that generation. But it's all an academic exercise, as the playing field was leveled off the year immediately following, and ATI never again lagged behind in this regard. In fact, they were the first to support DirectX 11, and the first with true DirectX 12 support years later. So I hope you found this look back on this controversial subject from 2004 informative. Moving forward, we've got some more card battles videos on the way, a 20th anniversary to celebrate, and some bonus videos sprinkled in between. And oh yeah, the GPU history project that I've been teasing a lot, coming very soon. So you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel if you find any of that interesting and you want to stay up to date on all the stuff that we've got coming up. Thanks for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been Pixel Pipes.